All right. Hello. Welcome to our group presentation on the book Sweetness and Power by Sydney Mintz. My name is Jenna Wallner, and my teammates are Ellen Scott, Alexis Hawk, and Eric Warda. Today, we will introduce you to the book and its themes by giving a brief summary of each chapter, and after reading the book, we compiled our thoughts on both the strengths and the weaknesses of this book. Finally, we hope to help you decide if this is a good read or not for you. First, I'll give you a little background on the author Sydney W. Mintz. So he was born in 1922 and recently passed away in 2015. He was an American anthropologist. He studied psychology as his undergrad and then got a PhD in anthropology at Columbia University. He actually helped found the anthropology department at Johns Hopkins University, which is pretty cool. He conducted a large portion of his research in the sugar growing regions of Puerto Rico, and he focused on food anthropology. Hence his nickname, Father of Food Anthropology. He wrote several books and over 200 scientific articles on the Caribbean anthropology, slavery, and peasantry, and he did many sociocultural analyses. So now I'll let Ellen tell you a little bit more about the book.
In today's day and age, sugar can be found in nearly every food item on grocery store shelves. Because sugar has become such a common necessity in our lives, it's easy to forget about its history and how it's become the staple that it is in our world today. After captivating his audience by discussing sugar's role in our world today, Mintz flashes back in time to draw out the pattern in which sugar spread across the world, beginning in Persia and India, where sugar is believed to have originated. As Mintz makes his way toward Europe, the readers discover that sugar wasn't always consumed by the common public. According to Mintz, in 1650, sugar was first introduced to the British and was a luxury item only acquired by the wealthy aristocrats. From here, the book begins to unpack the complexity of sugar's production and how Britain's involvement in the slave trade grew with its consumption as the demand grew and production struggled to supply the world's cravings. The British used modern capitalist systems to facilitate economic growth through colonialism, and with colonialism came involvement in the slave trade to gain profit using their colonies' fertile land to their advantage. By now, we realize that sugar isn't quite so simple a food item as we thought, and this was only a fraction of what Mintz discussed. Throughout the book, Mintz tries to chronologically spell out for the reader the events that led to the explosion of sugar consumption that persists to this day, and the impact sugar made on global and economic systems in hopes of opening our eyes to the history behind that sweet taste we all love. Now on to Alexis with chapter 1.
All right, guys. So chapter 1 overviews sugar as an important factor in advancing the course of history before the 20th century. And it was said that sugar was as valuable as gold in the emerging world trade system after the discovery of the New World, and it was an international commodity, and it facilitated capitalism and economic development in Europe. So the book focuses, and specifically this chapter focuses on sugar in the form of sucrose extracted from sugarcane and how the meanings associated with its use gradually changed in the centuries since sucrose was first introduced into the English diet. So by 1650, sugar was a staple of the wealthy and noble British classes, and these classes were stated in the book, classes that figured in their medicine, literary imagery, and displays of rank. By 1800, everyone in England ate sugar, and it became nearly 1/5 of all the calories in the English diet by the 20th century. Mintz, however, did not see this trend as an important milestone in the human's predisposition for sweetness. He rather explores how sugar became centrally important for the British by examining its cultural context and the meanings that sugar held for different classes. Focusing on early human nourishment, Mintz uses the example of the Bemba people in Africa. These people, and most in early history, gained nourishment from one type of staple food accompanied with a side food. So that staple food was ubwali, as the Bemba people stated it, and it's usually a form of maize, and umunani is a complementary food, and this complementary food was usually picked to make the main dish more interesting and easier to swallow. With the introduction of a new food into society, in this case, sugar, Mintz described this incorporation as entering into pre-existing social and psychological contexts and acquire or are given contextual meanings by those who use them. Mintz says that humans create new meanings and adjust to them as new products like sucrose and are put to different uses, like a sugar sweetener. And then chapter 2 outlines the history of sugar production from the first domestication of sugarcane in New Guinea over 1,000 years ago. And then it goes into the plantation system in the Caribbean during the 18th century. So Mintz and other anthropologists believed that sugar was likely invented in Persia or India, and then it was introduced to Europe by the Arabs in like the 7th and 8th centuries, and including the techniques with its cultivation and a taste for this different sweetness. Sugar production sites moved from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic islands like La Palma and Azores, and eventually to the Caribbean and then the American mainland. This is where European colonial powers fully developed the highly disciplined plantation system of sugar production. So comparing the sugar plantations, the Caribbean developed into almost a unique hybrid system that differed from the traditional European agricultural production, but it did not fully represent your typical capitalist working environment, while the Americas plantation was almost undeniably industrial. A few industrial features that were stated in the book by Mintz included the combination of agriculture and processing under one authority, and the interchangeability of the labor force characteristic of a lengthy middle period much later in the history of capitalism. So this goes into, there was heavy slave labor, especially in sugar production, dating back to the early Mediterranean production, and it expanded massively into the Caribbean. Thousands of slaves were brought to the English sugar producing colonies, and this kind of introduced a state policy of mercantilism, I guess. And it stated that England's relationship to the Caribbean colonies until the 19th century, and it was a very restrictive policy that benefited different parties, mainly the UK and England parties, and it hindered others, mainly the Caribbean. In the book, Mintz states the policy as you can't buy any finished goods from anywhere else. You can't sell any of your tropical products elsewhere, and everything is shipped in British boats and British bottoms. This basically states that the sugar islands were required to produce goods from England and sell as tropical products exclusively to the motherland in British boats. While this arrangement was expensive, it was very beneficial for English business and political interests. And I'll say Eric for chapter 3.
All right, so chapter 3's themes focus on the popularity and consumption of sugar throughout time. Like as stated, sugar started out as a luxury to the rich until the 18th century when it became extremely abundant and cheap. Demand was extremely high and cultivation areas were growing rapidly despite the strict weather conditions required by growth of sugar. And as time progressed and demand increased, this is where tons of people utilized sugar in crucial parts of their diet. It was a key staple to their diet and they were consuming concerning amounts of it. And as far as the uses of sugar, it mainly started out being used for medicines and spices because it was scarce and very expensive to use. Sugar was used as medicine for symptoms like upset stomach, fever, or even cough, because they believed it helped reverse the negative symptoms experienced on the human body. And sugar was also used in the medicine field by helping consume medicines with a bad taste. Sugar would help block out the taste and helped individuals to be able to consume the medicines they needed without the disgusting taste. Sugar's usage spice-wise was mainly for taste. Sugar obviously tastes very good, so using it with spices for a little extra flavor made foods much more enjoyable to eat. And while sugar was used for taste and medicine benefits a lot during earlier times, it was also used for paste to form sculptures, food preservation and structure, and decorations when mixed with other materials. And the sugar was actually great for decoration because it could be used to form and decorate structures that are edible. This was kind of like a fun, creative thing to do for the people, that the people did, I mean. As time kept progressing, and sugar became cheaper and more popular, it was becoming utilized more for food and consumption purposes. People were consuming sugar on the daily, and it was a great food source for them. They would mix it with tons of foods to sweeten the flavor, and it was also a great source of calories and could fill up your stomach so you were not starving. And after the 1800s up to modern day, individuals were and are finding ways to make things like holiday treats and sweet dishes with sugar as one of the main ingredients. Sugar was extremely important for the people and provided positive impacts to varieties of individuals around the world. Now we'll go back to Ellen for chapter 4.
So this chapter discussed the rise of capitalism in England and how it changed the use of sugar for the British working class. And due to this higher demand, then prices for sugar fell. And while wages increased for factory workers, this allowed consumption of sugar in Britain to increase drastically, as sugar was used as an energy boost for long days at work on their lunch breaks. So due to these energy boosts, worker productivity also increased and overall benefited business owners. And the free market shift in economy allowed everyone to decide what they wanted to consume. And often this was lower price items like sugar, and which was made possible by the cheap labor system of slavery. And in some, slaves did the sugar producing while the working class did most of the consuming.
All right, so chapter 5, the theme that chapter 5 focuses on is sugar in the more recent centuries. The drastic increase in sugar in recent centuries is actually kind of mind-blowing. For instance, 3 years after 1884, the U.S. sugar consumption went from 38 to 60.9 pounds consumed per person per year. This is almost double and shows the great impact sugar had on the U.S. specifically. And even after the practical double in sugar consumption in a 3-year span, it kept climbing in the years to come. This is the point where sugar was practically only used for food or consumption purposes and not medicine, spices, and all the other things I stated. It was so popular that individuals were consuming sugar over meat products because sugar was a source of cheap, plentiful calories to last you through the day. The high caloric state of sugar provided tons of energy to people, and it was especially extremely impactful to workers who struggled to get food regularly. Sugar would provide the energy they needed to work good hours and make the money to support themselves and their families, like we kind of stated in chapter 4. By the 1900s, sugar was being utilized more than ever recorded, especially in the US and England. Sugar was practically a necessity at this point and a true staple in diet and economy. However, some countries surprisingly didn't hop on the sugar use kind of abuse train. An example is France. They have a pretty low sugar use and were never extremely involved with it at all. But overall, sugar throughout the years has helped so many people and created so many historical events, has been becoming more and more popular ever since it was invented and is still thriving in today's day. And back to Jenna.
So there was a lot we liked about this book. Firstly, we saw how Mintz portrayed his passion and care towards his work and research. He covers all aspects of sugar's history, including societal, historical, and economical impacts worldwide. We also liked how he included sugar's impact on trade and global economic systems, which we don't hear a lot about in today's history books. Mintz also spent time in oppressed areas of the world for his research, which provided a basis for how he can show such empathy for the slaves that were exploited during this time. And finally, he lived in the Puerto Rican community with an actual sugarcane worker, which gave him access to firsthand information and experiences. And this allowed him to provide rich details about the lives of these workers. And now I'll pass it back to Alexis to discuss some weaknesses.
So while there were many strengths with this book, there were also a few weaknesses. Mintz has only been around poverty in his research, so that creates kind of a barrier and a bias. He didn't necessarily see how sugar worked in these like rich communities, and he didn't really have like firsthand research, you could say, and it was really only around the poorer and more poverty side of things. And it was also written a long time ago. It was written 38 years ago. So the wording is kind of a little bit difficult to comprehend at some instances, and there are just some sentences that don't necessarily make sense until you break it down and maybe read it a few times. And the book also seems repetitive at times and can bore readers if you are not overly into the book, and if it's not something you necessarily enjoy reading. But overall, Mintz did a fantastic job, especially for how long ago it was written and how true it still is to this day.
For final thoughts and opinions, this book, if you are looking for a lengthy, in-depth analysis of the history of sugar and the role it played in different countries, then this would be a good book for you. And however, this is not a book for people interested in a brief overview of sugars, as it goes a big deep dive into every detail of sugar. So this may not be for everyone, but yeah. And thank you for watching our presentation.